Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Weekly Updates. This is now officially week one. We got a full slate of college football. Let's dive right into this. As always, this is all something that can change. It's fluid. If you have suggestions, please leave them below in the comments. It's a way for me to get better and a way for hopefully you guys to enjoy these updates and have more information for you. Or maybe you don't want as much as we're about to give you. Again, this is the first one with a full slate of games, so let's dive into it. First thing off, we're going to start in Washington. UW played Boise State. Now, UW won this game 56-19. Can you say upset alert? Well, a lot of people were saying that, or at least people expected Boise State to cover the spread. And after the first quarter, things looked pretty well with Boise State up 6-0. That'd be the last time the Broncos were happy as UW told Boise State to bow down. Offensively, UW's Heisman quarterback candidate Michael Penix Jr. went 29 of 40 for 450 yards and 5 touchdowns. His favorite target, Rome Odunze, had 7 catches for 132 yards and a touchdown. Now, this UW team looked legit, and while we're only one game into the season, it's hard not to say that Penix is the Heisman favorite. UW will host Tulsa next week. Staying in Washington and flipping to the rival, we got WSU Cougars playing against Colorado State. Now, Wazoo won this game 50-24. Do not let that score fool you. The game wasn't close. Colorado State opened the game driving down the field and kicking a field goal to go up 3-0. That would be the last time they saw the lead, as Wazoo would go on to score 29 unanswered points. Cam Ward went 37 of 49 for 451 yards and 3 touchdowns, as he also had another rushing touchdown. However, here's the bad. He fumbled the ball twice and lost both fumbles. Defensively, the Cougs were playing super well until the fourth quarter, when it seemed as if they started to coast, possibly taking that foot off the gas and allowing the Rams to score 21 points. Luckily, the Cougs were able to score 21 of their own to keep up with them. WSU faces Wisconsin at home next week. More on that later. Going down to the FCS level, Eastern Washington played North Dakota State University and lost, unfortunately, 10-35. Eastern played as well as they possibly could, but unfortunately, number 2 ranked Bison were just too much. Dual threat quarterback Kekoa Visperis struggled, going 23 for 39 for a touchdown interception. He wasn't too impressive on his feet as he ran for 34 yards on 13 attempts. Defensively, things weren't much better as North Dakota State ran for 349 yards on the Eagles. Yes, you heard that right. They ran for almost 350 yards. Now, it's hard to judge Eastern based off this game since it was just absolutely dominated by the Bison. So we'll have more information on how we think Eastern is going to do next week, hopefully. Eastern's going to be playing Fresno State next week. Central Washington played Weber State this week and lost 10-35. It was the first ever Battle of the Wildcats. Tough loss in part due to the penalties. Central did to themselves. Head coach Chris Fisk, who we had a podcast with, which the release date is in the future, said it best. I was really proud of the effort the kids had. I was disappointed in the penalties and the lack of discipline we had, especially in the third quarter. But we took a lot away from this game, and that we can't wait to see what we learned next week playing against Montana Tech. I'm proud of the effort the kids had the whole night and the way they represented Central Washington University. Central had 2 different quarterbacks throw the ball in the game. Look for Darius Morrison to start establishing himself as the team's primary receiver with the game he put up. Central Washington University is going to host the 6th-ranked team in the NAIA in the Montana Tech Orators. Heading to PLU, who played the University of Redlands. Unfortunately, they lost this game 14-24. After a hard-fought and scoreless first quarter, PLU jumped out to a 14-0 lead against Redlands. But unfortunately, that was the last time the Lutes would have scored in this game. Redlands went and outscored them 24-0 to end the game. Overall, PLU struggled a lot on special teams, allowing way too many short fields, and Redlands took advantage of all those and was able to score. Quarterback Darius Chafin went 11 for 15 for 1 touchdown while running for another. Defensively, the Lutes were led by Nico Gala, who led the Lutes with 11 different tackles. PLU is going to be on the road next week, going to play Concordia. We're going to head over to Puget Sound playing Lewis and Clark University. A win, 42-35. Offense was the name of the game, and boy, there was a lot of it. Let me give you some stats for the Loggers just so you guys understand how good of a game this was. 438 total yards, 21 first downs. Quarterback Mason Benning went 23 of 36 for 258 yards, 3 touchdowns, while running in another 2. Joe Gallagher seemed to be Benning's favorite target as he ended the game with 11 total receptions for 103 yards. And on the ground, Henry Hernandez led the Loggers in rushing with 74 yards. Defensively, Emmanuel Culpepper led the team in tackles with 11. This game was a shootout, and something tells me that if Bennings continues to play at this level, there's going to be a lot of games that end this way, and it might be hard to count the Loggers out of any game no matter who they're playing. The Loggers will place Lewis and Clark Valley in an exhibition game next week. Now off to the Whitworth Pirates and Pacific Northwest Christian College. Now, this was a 52-0 win for the Whitworth Pirates. It was a battle in the Templeton household as the son played his coach, Bill Templeton, over at Pacific Northwest Christian College. There isn't too much to touch on in this game. Offensively, we might have a quarterback controversy going on for Whitworth. Starting Austin Ewing went 2 for 8 for 23 yards, while backup Ryan Blair came in, went 7 of 10 for 99 yards and 1 touchdown. Maybe it's not a big deal, but it is something to keep an eye on. When it's 52-0, it's kind of hard to put water into what the coaches were going for. Defensively, the Pirates had 34 different players register a tackle. Yes, 34. They also held PNCC to 65 yards of total offense. Whitworth will play Eastern Oregon next week, and PNCC will play Montana Northern next week. Now let's hop into Oregon. Oregon Ducks versus Portland State, 81-7. Yes, that's the score of the football game. Scoring record. The Ducks mascot ended up doing 526 push-ups. How? Well, every time Oregon scores, the mascot does the equivalency to what the points are. So if Oregon scores a touchdown to go up 28, he'll do 28 push-ups. When they score the next time, he'll do 35 push-ups. This all culminated in him doing 526 push-ups. Oregon, in their final season in the Pac-12, decided they wanted to win it all and took an excellent first step, winning 81-7. Oregon went up 8 early in the first quarter, and Portland State answered with a touchdown of their own and getting the game to 7-8. That would be the last time Portland State would score. Remember how Bo Nix was going to getting some Heisman hype and people didn't really know what to think? Well, he might be on that list as well. Nix went 23 of 27 for 287 yards and 3 touchdowns and led Oregon to 8 straight scoring drives. The Ducks ended up playing 25 true freshmen this game. 25! Perhaps none were more exciting than Dante Dodell, who went for 55 yards and a touchdown. Oregon will head to Lubbock next week to face the Texas Tech Red Raiders. Now on to the game of the week. Oregon State Beavers versus San Jose State. Oregon State won this game 42-17. Remember how we wondered if Oregon State was legit and we said, man, if this squad had a quarterback, they could be something special. Well, quarterback transfer DJU from Clemson answered every single question we had tonight. He went 20 of 25 for 239 yards, 2 touchdowns, and just because he could, he decided to run in 2 more on the ground. His backfield teammate, Damian Martinez, had 18 carries for 145 yards. Defensively, this team was led by John McCartan, who had 2 sacks, in addition to his other 3 tackles in the game. Last week, I said this game is going to tell us a lot about OSU, and it did. Believe the hype. OSU, in what very well might be the last season of the Pac-12's existence, has a chance to win the whole thing. OSU will host UC Davis in the first game in the renovated Research Stadium next week. Portland State versus Oregon Ducks. We just spoke about this game a minute ago, but we have to touch on it. As I promised everyone, we will always give updates on both sides. Portland State lost this game 7-81. Freshman linebacker Michael Montgomery from Garfield High School, for my Washington folks, led the Vikings with 14 tackles. Senior offensive lineman Shiloh Tahassee from Ballard High School, again, for my Washington folks, played in his 38th career game, starting his 34th career game. He leads the Vikings in both categories currently. The 81 points allowed were the most ever by a Viking team. So the only real way to go is up. The Vikings will head to Laramie, Wyoming to face the Cowboys next week. Now we're getting down to some lower levels. We had the Western Oregon Wolves facing SDSU. Western Oregon lost a really tough game against the reigning FCS national champion South Dakota State Jackrabbits, 7-47. Quarterback Gannon Winker finished 12 for 23, passing for 67 yards, while fellow quarterback Jason McCarty was 2 for 2 for 40 yards and rushed for a 37-yard score to also lead the team in rushing. Might be something to keep an eye on, maybe a switch at quarterback. Darren Ulrich Jr. led the team defensively with 11 tackles, including 8 solo. Western Oregon will face Lincoln University next week. The George Fox Bruins played Howard Payne and lost that game 3-17. It was the very first game of the year, and both teams started slow. The Bruins The Bruins ended up punting in their first 2 possessions, and Howard Payne driving but not converting. The Bruins played well in the first quarter, forcing a missed field goal and a turnover on downs. The Bruins offense, however, failed to get anything going in the second quarter, with their first 3 possessions resulting in 3 and outs. Unfortunately, the offense never truly got going. Starter Max Ritchie went 10 for 21 and 92 yards, while DeMontre Thomas finished 10 of 16 for 215 yards and an interception. Maybe Thomas will get the start next week in what was an uninspiring Bruins offense. George Fox is going to play Pacific next week in the Oregon Cup. Lewis and Clark Pioneers versus the Puget Sound Loggers. As we talked about earlier, 38-42 loss for Lewis and Clark. But we promised to highlight you on every single team. Offensively, the Pioneers were led by senior quarterback Cruz Montana, who threw for a career-high 352 yards and accounted for 5 touchdowns. Defensively, senior linebacker Justin Hope led the team with 9 total tackles and 2 for loss. Lewis and Clark will stay home and play Willamette University next week. Well, here's a fun one for you. Pacific Boxers versus Chapman. Now, technically, this game was canceled. But at time of cancellation, the score was 0-24 in favor of Chapman. For 35 minutes of this game, Chapman was handling Pacific with little to no pushback. Offensively, Chapman scored 3 touchdowns on 213 rushing yards. On defense, 3 sacks. They had 3 sacks and 8 total tackles for loss, holding Pacific to a negative rushing yardage total. Luckily for Pacific, this game was declared a no contest, so no stats from this game will count, but the bit of film they do have, Pacific has a lot to fix. Pacific is going to host George Fox University in the home opener part 2 next week. The Willamette Bearcats play Laverne and won a game 24-21. Talk about a close game. Willamette at 2 different times in this game trailed 14-0 and 21-7, but they rallied on each occasion. The team showed grit and it paid off as junior Gabriel Herrera rushed for 132 yards on 22 carries, and his senior running mate Justin Javoria scored the game-winning touchdown on a 42-yard run with 6 minutes and 55 seconds left in the game. Defensively, the Bearcats were able to force 3 turnovers and held the Leopards to 157 total offensive yards. Willamette will head to Portland next week to play Lewis and Clark. Here we have your Eastern Oregon Mountaineers playing Montana Western, and actually they lost this game 14-38. Now, the Mountaineers opened this year with a tough loss. There's no denying that, right? With the offense showing little to no life in the first half, they actually went into halftime down 10-0. But in terms of moral victories, the Mountaineers were able to put up 14 points in the second half, while quarterback Quincy Glasper went 27 of 44 for 258 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Eastern Oregon will stay home and play Whitworth next week. Our last game in Oregon, guys. Southern Oregon Raiders versus College of Idaho. They got mollywopped 16-14-2. The mighty 12-ranked Coyotes decided to feast on some Raider meat this last Saturday. The name of the game, I can only assume, was possession. Of the first 40 plays of this game, the Raiders possessed the ball for 36 of them. Yes, you heard that right. 40 plays from scrimmage. Who had possession of the ball? The Southern Oregon Raiders. They had a 6-0 lead on a pair of field goals to show for the 2 drives that combined to eat up 20 minutes of clock. So 36 offensive plays. You have the ball for 20 minutes of chewed up clock, and all you get away with is 6 points. That's where every single positive ends. The Oats didn't get on board until 45 seconds remained in the half. And so they scored, and then on the next play from scrimmage, the Oats had a pick 6 to go 14-6 at halftime. Quarterback Max Struck had 13 completions for 95 yards and an interception. The Raiders will host Willamette next week. On to Idaho. The Boise State Broncos played the UW Huskies. They lost 1956. We spoke about this one as well. Offensively, sophomore running back Ashton Jeanty had 109 yards rushing and 1 receiving touchdown. Additionally, Boise State's offensive line only allowed 1 sack, which is huge. Defensively, Alexander Tubner recorded a team-high 11 tackles. Boise State will welcome UCF to its Smurf turf next week. Now, the Idaho Vandals played Lamar and won 42-17. Your Idaho Vandals won their first game of the year. Yes, as we all expected, Idaho's picking off where they were last year as being one of the most dominating teams in the FCS. Reigning Jerry Rice Award winner Giovanni McCoy ended the game with going 14 of 19 for 164 yards and 2 touchdowns and 1 interception. He also went for 41 yards on 5 rushes. The win was so dominating that McCoy ended up sitting out, as well as most of the Idaho's team, but they ended up sitting out most of the fourth quarter. If you want an idea of how potent this offense is, let this sink in. They had 497 yards on offense, 273 rushing yards on 36 carries. They averaged 7.6 yards per carry. This offense is legit. The Vandals are going to play the University of Nevada next week. Your Idaho State Bengals played San Diego State and lost a tough game 28-36. Now, Idaho State played extremely well in what ended up being a tough loss, but they scored 28 points. That 28 points tied the highest total the Bengals scored in all of 2022, and they matched that in 1 game against an FBS opponent. Offensively, 2 Bengal quarterbacks took snaps. Hunter Hayes and Jordan Cook combined them for 309 total passing yards. Defensively, the Bengals were led by senior captain Calvin Pitcher, who had 10 tackles on the night. The Bengals will head to Logan, Utah next week to play the Utah State Aggies. Last and not least for your Oregon, your Idaho schools, College of Idaho played Southern Oregon and won 42-16. Offensively, Andy Peters had 12 completions for 212 yards, 2 touchdowns, and a pick. Defensively, Tanner Steele racked up 7 tackles, including a big boy sack. The Coyotes will welcome Montana Western next week. On to our schools in Montana. The Montana Grizzlies opened up the year with an impressive 35-20 win over Butler. What's surprising here? Nothing. There are some big things to unpack from this game, though. As I mentioned on the Pacific Northwest Sports TikTok page, Montana is returning all of their offensive line. And in doing so, it allowed freshman Eli Gilman in his first start to run for 119 yards and a touchdown. Montana's also yet to name a starting quarterback. So with this in mind, sophomore Sam Vidlak and senior Clifton McDowell each showed their strengths. Now, Vidlak went 15 of 25 for 180 passing yards, 1 touchdown, but 2 picks. McDowell didn't actually get to showcase his passing much, as he really came in the second half, and he just controlled the game, right? He had 1 completion for 5 yards. That's it. Montana will head to St. George, Utah to take on Montana Tech next week. What I'm hoping is we can get some more of McDowell to figure out if he's going to be the starter or if Vidlak is. Now, to the bitter rival, University of Montana Bobcats played Utah Tech and won 63-20. The Bobcats have a guy who's going to be striking fear into Big Sky opponents over the next 4 years. His name is running back Scotty Humphrey, a freshman who rushed for 114 yards and 3 touchdowns in his college debut. Senior Level Prince Jr. led the defense with 7 tackles, but I want to give a shout out to big defensive end David Alston. He came up with his first career collegiate interception. Always an accomplishment for the big boys. Montana State is going to be on the road next week to face a number 1 ranked South Dakota State in what is sure to be an extremely physical game. You might say, Jay, why is that going to be a physical game? Let me tell you a little later. Your Carroll Fighting Saints won a tough game against Montana Tech, 21-19. Now, the Copper rivalry game is always a good one. Talk about an intense back-and-forth game. The game came down to a crucial 3rd and 7 with just over 2 minutes remaining. Senior Cameron Rothy made the play of the game. He caught a 9-yard reception to give Carroll the first down, allowing the Saints to enter victory formation, their first and what they hope to be many for the rest of the year. The Saints are going to go play number 14 ranked NAIA St. Thomas next week, and what is sure to be another tough game. As we spoke about earlier, Montana Western Bulldogs versus Eastern Oregon, 38-14 win. Now, Montana Western played some high-level football with redshirt freshman quarterback Michael Plasandri going 17 of 26 for 329 yards and 4 touchdowns to 1 pick. Defensively, redshirt sophomore Briar Monson had a day, totaling 7 tackles, 3.5 tackles for a loss, and 3 sacks. This was capped off with a 20-yard loss he forced onto Eastern Oregon. Montana Western's heading up to Caldwell, Idaho to play College of Idaho next week. I can only imagine this is going to be another amazing game. Your Montana Tech Orediggers, they fell to Carroll College 19-21, as we talked about. But in no way did Montana Tech roll over in this game. After the Saints got up to a 14-0 lead, your Diggers went up to score 3 times unanswered, ending the quarter down by 1, 14-13. Like I stated earlier, this game truly came down to the final 2 minutes. The Orediggers can hold their heads high because starting quarterback Blake Thielen went 15-25 for 255 yards and a touchdown. Now, the Orediggers are going to head over to Washington next week to play fellow winless opponent in the Central Washington Wildcats. On to Wyoming to cover our one team in all of Wyoming that we happen to have. Yee-haw, Cowboys. Alrighty, can someone say overtime? Because not just any overtime, double overtime. The Red Raiders started out ahead 17-0, but Wyoming answered in the second quarter, putting up 10 points on their own to enter halftime down 17-10. In the third quarter, Wyoming scored a touchdown while holding the Red Raiders scoreless. But the Red Raiders were able to match the Cowboys in the fourth quarter as both squads had a field goal. Fast forward to OT number 2, quarterback Andrew Peasley completed an 11-yard touchdown pass to tight end Josh Michael Geilenberg on 4th and 7, and running back Sam Scott punched the 2-point conversion in for the upset win. Wyoming is going to welcome the Portland State Vikings to War Memorial Stadium next week in what is sure to be another win. Hang in there, guys. We're on to Utah. The BYU Cougars opened up the year against Sam Houston. They won the game 14-0. Now, BYU started off this game on a high, scoring a touchdown on the first drive of the game. After that, the offense was lifeless. And I do mean that with the worst possible way. On the next 8 drives, BYU punted 6 times and turned it over on downs twice. In those 8 drives, the Cougars totaled just 59 yards of total offense. With 4 minutes left in the third quarter, BYU was holding on to a 7-0 lead. Now, the Cougars got their ball at their own 37-yard line, and the coaches said, let's put in true freshman running back LJ Martin into the game. He was the spark the BYU offense was desperately looking for, as the end of the day with 91 yards on 16 attempts. BYU will welcome Southern Utah into Provo next week, and what they hope can be a game to get their offense on track. Maybe that means running the offense through LJ Martin. On to the game that I think everybody wants to talk about, the Utah Utes versus Florida Gators. They won the game 24-11. Utah started off the season with a bang. First play of the game, wide receiver Money Parks hauled in a 70-yard pass for a touchdown. True freshman wide receiver Mikey Matthews led the team with 4 receptions for 34 yards. Perhaps Cam Rising, who hopefully can come back soon, when he comes back, he might have 2 elite receivers. On defense, safety Cole Bishop led the way with 11 tackles. He had 1 tackle for loss, 1 sack, and a forced fumble. This Utah team, if they get Cam Rising back, will be dynamic and could be a college football playoff contender. Utah's going to head to Waco, Texas next week to play the Baylor Bears. Now on to the third team we have over in Utah State. We have the Utah State Aggies playing Iowa, losing 14-24. Well, Iowa might not have the right offensive coordinator. Now, in his amended contract, offensive coordinator Brian Ferentz had an agreement that requires his offense to score 25 points per game. He couldn't do that, but the 24 they put up was enough to beat Utah State. Now, Cooper Legis, who we talked about on our TikTok, went 32 for 48 for 213 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. Perhaps we can blame the rough start to the year on the roster turnover, as the Aggies had 26 players make their Utah State debut on Saturday. Utah State will host Idaho State next week. On to your Utah Tech Trailblazers. They played Montana State and lost 20-63. And we did speak on this earlier, but Utah Tech does have some positives for next week. Trailblazers defensively on the opening drive of the game held the Bobcats to 72 yards on 9 plays. That set them up with the first and goal on the Utah Tech 3-yard line. However, Utah Tech had a nice goal line stance and ended up getting the ball back to their offense on the 1-yard line. No one on offense really stood out for Utah Tech overall. They finished with 309 yards. It was a well-balanced effort, including 260 yards in the air. Now, Utah Tech will host the 14th-ranked Grizzlies next week. Their Weber State Wildcats beat the Central Washington Wildcats 35-10. Again, we spoke about this earlier. But after leading 14-10 at halftime, the Wildcats really turned it on, scoring 21 unanswered points in the third quarter. Here's some guys to listen for as the season progresses. Quarterback Kylan Weiser was 12 of 21 for 160 yards and a touchdown. On defense, senior captain Winston Reed finished with 10 tackles, 1.5 sacks, and 3.5 sacks for a loss. Weber State will be on the road next week when they play Northern Iowa. Southern Utah Thunderbirds versus Arizona State. Now, they lost this game 21-24. Do not let the score surprise you. Southern Utah played extremely well in this game and almost came away with the win versus Arizona State. I think head coach Delane Fitzgerald said it best, quote, "Our game plan offensively and defensively was really good tonight and showed. We were a small mistake here and there from coming out of there with the win, but we don't lack heart on the team or the coaching staff." End quote. When you look at this game, you really can't find one moment where you say, that's it. That's what cost them the game. They truly were 1 to 2 plays away from winning the game. Quarterback Justin Miller ended the game 8 of 17 for 123 yards and a touchdown with QBR of 127.2. Southern Utah will head to Provo next week to play BYU. Now, 2 things we're going to add to our weekly updates. Our player of the week and upset of the week. Player of the week, Michael Penix Jr. I mean, what can you say? The guy diced up the Broncos offense and shouldn't have any problem doing the same thing versus Tulsa next week. Expect to hear a lot about him if he keeps up this level of play. Upset of the week, Wyoming. Wyoming went into the game 14-point underdogs, and even after falling behind 17-0, they rallied the troops and came back for a double OT win that required a 4th-down miracle and a 2-point conversion. What more can you want from college football? This game was huge. Perhaps Craig Bull has enough up his sleeve to help Wyoming be competitive at the top of the Midwest Conference, Mountain West Conference this year. All right, game of the week. Jay, what's your prediction? Okay, my prediction is Wazoo versus Wisconsin as game of the week. And my prediction for the score is WSU beating Wisconsin 34-28. Now, look, Wisconsin is coming into Pullman next week, and this game is going to be crazy. Wazoo's looking to prove that last year's win wasn't a fluke, while Wisconsin is looking to prove it was a fluke. Wisconsin has some pretty crazy things happen this offseason. The biggest one being now that they're led by Luke Fickell. They won this week's game 38-17 against a less than talented Wazoo Buffalo team. Well, last year, the Cougars' defensive line was the big takeaway from this Wisconsin game. The D-line dominated Wisconsin in the trenches, and it was an extremely impressive game. After this Colorado State game, though, it's hard to imagine the D-line dominating them again. Cam Ward looked much more confident in the Cougs season opener. And if he can hold on to the ball and play the way we know he can, I can't imagine Wisconsin being able to stop the offense. This, my friends, is what we call a season-defining moment. If Wazoo can pull off the win, they'll put the Pac-12 on notice and perhaps ride this momentum all year long. Let's see how this goes. My bold prediction of this game, WSU wins in OT. Overall, I hope you guys enjoyed this weekly update. As always, leave comments. The only way I can improve is if I work with you guys to get better on my own craft. I appreciate you guys listening. Thank you for listening to Pacific Northwest Sports. Have a great day.